Hello, I'm Irv Dennis, board member and CFO at American Cornerstone Institute. I served in the executive branch in the Trump administration as the CFO of HUD under Secretary Carson. This podcast is part of our ACI's program called the Executive Branch for America, which is designed to educate what it's like to work in the executive branch. In today's topic, we're going to discuss the inner workings of NASA. We're so fortunate to be joined by Gabe Sherman, who also worked in the Trump administration and is a former chief of staff of NASA. Welcome, Gabe, and so glad you could join us today. And it's a real pleasure, and I know our audience is going to get an awful lot out of this conversation. You know, NASA is probably one of the most respected agency inside of government. You never hear any partisanship between them. It's always bipartisan.
Right.
So we're anxious to hear all about this. And maybe before we begin and discuss NASA, maybe just spend a little bit on your background and how you ended up at NASA in the role that you were in.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Irvin. Thank you for the opportunity. Think very, very highly of everything you guys have going on at American Cornerstone and everything that you're trying to do to equip the next generation to come in and take over inside of the executive branch and be effective on day one. So I think things like this are invaluable and can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity. My background to NASA is I am not a rocket scientist. I was not a physicist. I'm not one of those guys, one of those what we would call 50-pound heads with, just more smarts than they know what to do with. I took a very non-traditional path. So I went over to sell advertising one day to this gentleman at the Tulsa Air and Space Museum. Okay, this was back in 2010. And that gentleman's name was Jim Bridenstine. He was the executive director at the museum at the time, and we hit it off, and he hired me as his marketing director a few weeks later. Then he got this crazy idea to run for Congress. Neither of us had done that. So he said, "Hey, would you be my campaign manager?" Mm-hmm. I said, "Sure, never done that, but it's just marketing, right?" And so we jumped in and challenged an incumbent Republican at the time, and we ended up winning. Nobody thought we would. And so then I took over not only as the campaign manager, but the district director for Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District. Mm. And so for 5.5 years, I served in that capacity, running everything in the state for the congressional office and traveling back and forth between Oklahoma and DC quite a bit. And so Jim kind of found this unique niche in Congress, and that niche was space. Space is a very technical issue, and Irv, you've dealt with a lot of politicians. They usually flee from anything super technical. Jim's committee assignments were he was on the science committee in the House and subcommittee on the environment. And then he was on the defense committee. He was on his subcommittee was strategic forces. So he was armed services, strategic forces. So both of those dealt with space assets. So he kind of really leaned in. And my best political advice I ever gave him, Irv, was, "Hey, I don't think you should probably do a space town hall here in Oklahoma. I don't think that'll go well." And he did it, and it went phenomenally well. And he eventually became the NASA administrator during the Trump administration. And I was given the opportunity to come to NASA as the deputy chief of staff and moved into the chief of staff role during my time there. And so non-traditional path for sure, but I think that was actually beneficial to me over time.
It's funny, Gabe. I found myself in the executive branch. I'd never had aspirations, and it sounds like you didn't start off with aspirations of getting into politics or into the federal government. And it just happened to the opportunity approached itself to me after retiring after 38 years with Ernst & Young. And what a phenomenal experience. And I think it was a great experience, and I'm so glad that you had that. And you're still relatively young in your career, so you may have aspirations to continue in some form or fashion. At least we hope so. Like I mentioned, NASA is such a respected agency. But I also think it's probably very complex, maybe more complex than people realize. Could you maybe spend a little bit of time describing the mission or missions and the programs and a little bit about the agency?
You bet. No, complex is kind of an understatement, right? Like it is this beloved agency, not only here in the United States, but throughout the world. I mean, you see the NASA meatball logo on shirts across the globe. And it's, I think part of that is because of the mission, right? The mission is focused around exploration, discovery, and inspiration. And so NASA, historically, since its founding in the 60s, has done a tremendous job exploring in ways that have inspired people to reach further, to believe bigger. And so it's one of those missions, like you mentioned, inside of the federal government that's unique. It's unlike almost any agency in the federal government. And so it's just incredibly attractive. It's not a Republican agency or a Democrat agency. It is a very bipartisan agency, even though at times it can get hyperpartisan. And I tell people, I'll talk to you a little bit about the big picture structure of the agency, but I also tell people it was the most political job that I've ever had. And I was a campaign manager working in the House of Representatives for a Republican member of Congress, right? And NASA was the most political job, and I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But the structure of the agency, you have almost 20,000 NASA civil servants. You have an additional 70,000 plus contractors that support the agency. So you have this giant footprint that is skews towards the contractor workforce, but has a heavy contingent of civil servants. And that is spread out across NASA centers from the East Coast to the West Coast, right? And so each NASA center has a very specific mission. The ones that everybody knows about are Kennedy down in Florida, and Johnson down in Houston. But all the way out on the West Coast, you've got great NASA centers down in Armstrong, Southern California, kind of South Central California, that is doing tremendous things on the aeronautics front. And then if you move all the way over to kind of the central, kind of eastern section over in Ohio, there's a great NASA footprint with NASA Glenn. And so it's this agency that's spread across the country and kind of broken down into 4 kind of specific mission directorates. And each center serves a mission directorate. It might be Human Exploration and Operations is one mission directorate. The Science Mission Directorate is another. Aeronautics Mission Directorate is another. And then you have the Space Technology Mission Directorate. And so NASA is reorganizing all the time, but most of what NASA does fits into kind of those 4 buckets. With, again, in each one of those, heavy emphasis on exploration, discovery, and inspiration.
So, as the chief of staff, you saw it all from the very top and cascaded out. And I want to spend a few minutes on that. But as the chief of staff, maybe spend a few minutes on your primary responsibilities and what does a chief of staff mean within NASA? Sure,
great question. When we started this, I told you I'm not one of those rocket scientists, right? Yeah. And I think that actually was very beneficial for me coming in, because in that particular role, I didn't need to be the best engineer. I didn't need to be the best scientist. I didn't need to be the smartest technologist. What I needed to be able to do was understand the vision of the administration at large, understand the vision of the administrator and how we were going to go execute that vision down and in throughout NASA. And then look at all of the different assets, all of the resources, all of the people, all of the partnerships, and say, how do we mobilize this agency to go carry out this very big, audacious vision? And so very, very tactically, day in and day out, my job revolved around people, managing people, leading people, ensuring that the vision coming down, not only from the administration, but from the administrator, the NASA administrator, was very clear and executable. To where everybody could see themselves inside of it. And Irv, you remember this. President Trump was very clear in his vision for NASA. We're going to the moon. We're going to get there, and then we're going to use what we do and how we learn and how we achieve another moon landing and moon presence to go on to Mars. But he wanted to do it very differently. He didn't want it to be Apollo, right? He wanted us to go to the moon with commercial partners. He wanted us to go to the moon with international partners. And so we wanted to take this whole of the world and the whole of industry approach to that return to the moon. That's a really big, audacious goal, right? So how do you break that down very specifically? So we looked at human explorations and operations. They needed to make sure that the program, the Artemis program that we started while we were at NASA, had the capabilities required in partnership with commercial companies to deliver on that vision. The Science Mission Directorate needed to see themselves in that lunar mission, that lunar effort, and start to understand what is the lunar science that we can do, why does it matter, and how do we fold science, how do we take science and exploration, which are often competing interests inside of NASA, and actually marry them together and actually make everybody be moving in that direction of both exploration and scientific discovery. Then we had to go through the Space Technology Mission Directorate and say, okay, what are those key long lead technologies that we're going to need to mature to actually not only achieve the next moon landing, but move on to Mars. And so STMD, as we call it, they were always trying to think big picture, longer lead, and we were trying to work with them to identify and develop and encourage development of very specific technologies. And then aeronautics got to fold in because you think about the aeronautics component, we generally kind of relegate that to what happens right here on Earth. But there's so much that's going on inside of the Aeronautics Mission Directorate that feeds forward and informs some of those larger decisions whenever it comes to exploration and some of the other key components of making that moon landing and that eventual Mars landing a reality. So we had to rally the agency together to where everybody saw themselves within that big picture vision the president gave us. And so my job was that. Like that was really at the core of my focus. And that was not only internally, Irv, it was also externally. So it was maintaining connectivity with all of our commercial partners and helping them understand where they could best contribute. It was working with our international partners to where they could see themselves as a part of the Artemis program and understand where they could plug in. And so it was trying to manage all of these different parts and pieces. And oh, by the way, there's those people on the Hill that fund you. And so we had to make sure they understood why this was good for them day in and day out in their districts and in their states. And so all of those parts and pieces kind of fell into my purview. Of course, not just one guy, but trying to manage that effort day in and day out to ensure we were making progress was one of the biggest things that was on my plate.
Boy, did I hear a lot of complexity in that. And you talked about the commercial sector, and it's probably the agency that partners most with the private sector, I would imagine. And you used the stat of just, 20,000 civil service and 70,000 with contractors. That's a lot of contractors, and also getting OMB and Congress to get on board. And what makes federal government so hard is you have basically 4 years to make all that happen if you have a change in direction. If you're lucky, you have 8, but if it's a lot to change. Working with the commercial sector, I just finished reading Elon Musk's book, and he spends an awful lot of time talking about SpaceX and the vision of going to Mars and partnering with federal government. How do you do that with all of the commercial entities out there that you work with? And you've got to share a lot of common information, I would think. And how do you protect against the private or information that doesn't get leaked out, that shouldn't get leaked out to the different entities?
Absolutely. No, there's on the contracting side of things and in partnering with the commercial companies, there's some very, very, very strict and restrictive contractual agreements to ensure that a lot of that doesn't leak out into the open. But I'll tell you, this has been a massive shift, over the last 10 years with NASA to move from this idea of owning and operating every space mission to actually move into a place where now what we're doing is we're looking for where we can buy services and where we can actually make decisions about programs that encourage commercial development and commercial engagement. Because what happens, and you see this all the time, Irv, if an agency like NASA tries to own and operate everything, then the taxpayer dollar cannot be stretched and properly allocated into things that only NASA could do, that there's not a commercial market for, right? And so after the space shuttles, when the space shuttles retired in 2011, we were left with no access to space from United States soil, none. And so when that happened, I think everybody understood that's a real problem, and being dependent upon Russia for access back and forth to the International Space Station is not a place that we want to be in. So they started this program called Commercial Crew and Commercial Cargo, where you could start to NASA would contract with commercial providers to deliver cargo to and from the International Space Station and eventually crew. And so multiple contractors were selected to fulfill both of those services, the cargo side and the crew side. And what was so awesome while we were in the Trump administration is we got to see the very first ever commercial crew mission to deliver astronauts from United States soil to the International Space Station. And that happened May 30th of 2020 in the middle of a pandemic of all things, right? And so that was a tremendous partnership with SpaceX to start delivering, to reduce our dependency upon Russia, which we should never be in that position, and move to a day where we are, no kidding, standing up, encouraging, and developing a true commercial marketplace in space here in the United States that's capable and trustworthy enough to deliver our most precious cargo, our astronauts, our American heroes, back and forth to the International Space Station and eventually beyond to the moon and to Mars. And so that big commercial switch has been something that's taken time. But what's great is you're not only seeing it in NASA, you're seeing it in the Space Force and the Department of Defense, some of our national security assets and programs that are going to be critically important to security in space, because it is a very congested and contested domain now. You've got the Space Force looking at purchasing hundreds and thousands of commercial satellites to create resilience in our architectures and our most important architectures in space, moving away from a day when we had single satellites that were Battlestar Galactica satellites that the enemy could target very easily. Now we're moving towards constellations of satellites that if the enemy wants to shoot one or two down, it really doesn't mess with us at all. And so you see this, and that is coming through commercial providers. So you see it in NASA on the civil side, you see it in the national security side, the importance of the commercial players. And then you also see it even on the scientific side, on the NOAA side. NOAA is buying commercial weather data to help inform their numerical weather models. So everybody is starting to see the value of the commercial space marketplace and these commercial companies. And NASA's shift has been fundamental to developing that industry that's benefiting the globe.
Boy, but the more I hear about this, the more complex it sounds, and it's also funny. I'm sitting here reflecting. I graduated college, over 40 years ago, and these weren't even things you thought about back then.
Right.
Advancement of all this. You talked about the little bit of the relationship with Russia. I have to think that this is an international scope, right? And dealing with
absolutely
other countries. And what are the other major countries? I assume China's probably involved, and Japan. Talk a little about those relationships and interdependencies as we think about this.
Absolutely. So NASA is a really unique tool of diplomacy. Whenever for the United States, there are partnerships that can be formed, built around space, that terrestrially here on Earth can be a real challenge. And Russia is one of those perfect examples. They're they are our biggest partner on the International Space Station is Russia. And so we look at what's happening here terrestrially between the United States and Russia, and there's conflict. There's a very adversarial relationship. But every single day, above us in space, United States astronauts and Russian cosmonauts are working together for the benefit of humanity and on the International Space Station. And so those types of partnerships are just critically important. Those channels of communication, as you know, are critically important. And so we built tremendous partnerships with Japan and with ESA, the European Space Agency, and others, to where, no kidding, not only on the International Space Station, but as we move forward with the Artemis program, the Artemis Accords is the vehicle we've used to sign nations up to come with us to the moon. And that has been, I think we have to date, I want to say it's right around 40 countries that have signed the Artemis Accords that say we want to be a part of the next lunar landing and this lunar architecture and infrastructure. Artemis 2 is the next mission up for NASA, and that's going to be a flyby of the moon, the first crewed flyby of the moon since the Apollo program. That's going to have a Canadian astronaut on that particular mission. And then we just recently looked at bringing Japanese astronauts to the surface in partnership on the Artemis program. And so, space can be it can be a tremendously effective tool for diplomacy. Unfortunately, it's also something that absolutely is a part of our way of life, and everybody in the United States is incredibly dependent upon space-based services and assets. And so that makes it a prime target for our adversaries. Right. And so whenever you look at China and what China is doing in space right now, they have their own space station, they have their own lunar program, they're flying things that we can't see, don't know what their capabilities are. they have taken to space in a very aggressive way because they have recognized that and actually said publicly they realize it's the United States Achilles heel. And so it's becoming a very contested place. That is not the NASA mission. NASA is diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. But we have to start looking at space holistically and understanding it's not just a safe domain anymore like it's been in decades past. It's becoming more and more contested.
Well, it's interesting listening to this. It sounds like it's, as you say, diplomacy. It could be very unifying for the world and the countries,
Yes.
but it's also one that can create some vulnerability too. And it sounds like
Sure.
as long as people are aware of their vulnerabilities and they're attacking it, I think that's what's most important. As it relates, what is the budget for NASA? I should have asked that earlier.
So when we got there, it was in the upper teens. And whenever we left, it was in the low 20s, about 20, I think it's 22, 23 billion. So you're talking about this. I mean, it's just a small fraction of the overall budget. And I think since the Trump administration left, the top line for NASA hasn't really increased. And as you know, with inflation and everything else going on, that basically means it's been cut. And so it's budgeting is always a challenge when you're doing things in space. None of them are inexpensive, right? They're all pretty expensive. And so, yeah, budgets need to increase for sure. But one of the things that the Trump administration provided for us at the time was a belief that this was a place the United States needed to lead, that this was a place that we could be seen, that we could, no kidding, chart out a pathway, building a coalition of nations as we move forward with Artemis that would really benefit the United States. And so they backed it up with the budgets that were required. And so that was incredible for us on the inside and almost shocking to a lot of the NASA folks that were there that had devoted their careers there. They hadn't seen that level of commitment from an administration in a long time. So it was really healthy and really good.
Did it continue in this administration?
It has not. We were taking great steps while we were in office, and it's just kind of gone really flat, which creates challenges with inflation and everything else going on.
It's interesting. I write about this a little bit, and just comparing the business of the executive branch versus the private sector. The private sector has the luxury of time, and when you're in the executive branch, you don't. I think I mentioned earlier, you got 4 years, hopefully 8. But if and then the next administration comes in, they're going to have a separate agenda. The president's management agendas could be very, very different, and a lot of the things just could stop or slow down, and that's what makes change hard inside of government. So. What were some of your biggest challenges as the chief of staff?
Yeah. So I want to answer that question in a little bit of the context of what you just said from consistency between administrations. So when we set out, when we were given Space Policy Directive 1, and it's saying go to the moon to stay, this is the focus. What we wanted to do was actually make that program uncancelable. Since the days of Apollo, NASA had never had a lunar effort that transitioned from one administration to the next. Hadn't happened. It just starts and stops. And so our mission internally was to do everything that we could to ensure that Artemis was uncancelable, no matter whether we were staying for 4 years or for 8 years. That was the goal. And that no kidding, Irv, as a chief of staff, it was at the top of every meeting agenda. Didn't matter what meeting I was running. Every meeting agenda had that at the very top of it. That here is our objective. Our objective is to make this program uncancelable. And so to do that, as you know, you can't do that if it's a Republican-only program.
Right.
You can't do that if it's a United States alone program, right? You can't do that if it's just a government program. And so what we had to do day in and day out was look at the commercial partnerships, the political influence and partnerships that we needed, and also the international partnerships that we needed to ensure that this thing was going to cross the finish line, whatever finish line we had, 4 years or 8 years, that at that time, it was going to move from one administration to the next. And so my biggest challenge was working with the civil servants, not in an adversarial way,
right,
but helping them believe that we were committed to seeing certainty for them, to creating certainty for them, so that whenever they were coming to work every day, they weren't having to think about 3 years from now, this rug's going to be pulled out from under me. Like I just can't imagine devoting my life and my career to a pursuit and then having it changed on a dime every 3 to 4 years with the priorities of a new administration. So that was a heavy burden for us. We wanted to deliver for the administration, but we also wanted to deliver for the NASA civil servants who were devoting their lives to this effort. And so I'll never forget, in February of 2021, after the transition, we were still at work trying to ensure that Artemis was uncancelable. And we had, there was a Fox News reporter that asked Jen Psaki a question in a White House press briefing about where the administration stood on Artemis and sending the first woman and next man to the moon. And they really didn't have an answer. Mm-hmm. But about a day later, I think it was a day, maybe two later, they came back and went on record saying, we are in full support of the Artemis program. We are absolutely continuing to pursue this. We want to see the first woman on the moon. We want to see the next man on the moon. We want to see the next person or the first person of color on the moon. Yeah. And so they fully embraced this effort. And I'll tell you, Irv, that was an emotional moment for me and for a lot of our team, because we had spent 3.5 years, 4 years pushing to make this a reality. And that was by far the most difficult challenge as a chief of staff, is just saying, what can we do day in and day out to move the agency towards that objective? What are the most effective and important things we could be doing? And that just required tremendous bipartisanship and cooperation down and through the agency with our commercial partners and our international partners.
It also required tremendous leadership on your part and those that served at the top levels at NASA, because stuff like that doesn't happen without strong leadership, and getting people to think differently than the past is hard, right? And that requires a certain skill and a certain patience. And so thank you for doing that. That sounds like this is going to be a terrific program as we go forward. Before we run out of time, just a couple other quick questions. I really didn't appreciate how much fun I was going to have in different aspects of going into the administration. You get to do a lot of really, really unique things, and my family got to experience some of it. My wife and I were at parties and events that we never thought possible, however many years ago. What were some of the one of the couple of fun, unique things that you weren't anticipating that ended up being something you'll remember forever?
Yeah, I'll give you a big picture one, and then I'll give you a smaller one, right? On the big picture side, I'm a dad. I have 2 girls, and my wife. We moved from Oklahoma to Northern Virginia to be a part of this effort, and the mission was always very clear to me because I was in it every day, right? So they're at home trying to figure out life and what does it look like in Northern Virginia, and I'm running hard, trying to get people to the moon, right? I have this big picture vision and mission. And at the same time, it became really, really clear to me that if this mission was just mine and it wasn't my family's as well, then the long hours, the long days, everything that you experience where you're just putting in time and time and time, like all of that was going to get lost. It was going to be something that we weren't sharing in, but that Dad was going to do. And so I had multiple opportunities to take my girls and my wife down to Kennedy Space Center. Awesome. And yeah, I was working really hard around these launches, but they got to come on base and see these launches. They got to be a part of a lot of the events that surrounded each launch. And they started to, not when you see a rocket launch, it's pretty inspiring. But when you meet astronauts and you meet a lot of the workers and you meet other people that are helping Dad throughout this process, like it was contagious. The mission was contagious for them. And so that was something that was big picture. I never thought I would be standing with my wife and 2 daughters at Kennedy Space Center watching a launch of, whether it was a cargo launch or whether it was an actual crewed launch. I would have never thought that was an experience we were going to have. And yet we did. One of the coolest ones was having, during the pandemic, that first crewed launch during the pandemic, we had basically the entire cabinet down at Kennedy Space Center for that launch. And I'll just never forget, shaking Mike Pence's hand and walking around with, the president's team as they were just encouraging and thanking everybody that made that day possible. I mean, those are just big picture experiences you never think you're going to get to have. So that's the big picture side. The smaller side was every day, Irv, I got to walk through the doors of a place called NASA headquarters, right? And you get to meet people, everybody from the security officers at the front to the people, the kind of the personnel that are just making everything work inside of NASA headquarters, to the actual executives. You got to meet people and have experiences and have conversations about things you just would have never thought possible. There was one day my dad was actually up, and he and my mom were up on vacation, and I brought him up to the office to do something. And it just happened to be one of those days that went off the rails, and it was crazy. And I was sitting there having a conversation with a NASA executive, and we were working on not only the Artemis program, but what does it look like to go on to Mars, and what are some of the capabilities that we're going to need. And I'm sitting there having these conversations. My dad is kind of sitting over on the side. And afterwards, we're on a train back to my house afterwards. He's like, Gabe, that was incredible. Like, yeah. I didn't know that our country worked this way. Yeah. And so whenever you get to be inside the executive branch, as you were and as I was, you start to see how our country works. And some of it is really good and really encouraging. And then there's the other stuff. But so many of those people were very, very special to me throughout that time.
That's awesome. That's a great story. I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a surprise to me was how well our government does work, especially in a time of need, and how collaborative we are with the private partnerships with other countries, and how hard the employees and the civil service folks and the politicals, how hard they work. It's not an easy job. But it's also one that gave me a lot of satisfaction. My favorite 4 years of my professional career. It was unexpected, and you really, when you're working for the American people, it just gives you a different feeling.
Absolutely.
Gabe, before we wrap up, what are you doing now? I know all the networking that comes from the executive branch is phenomenal. I mean, I always tell younger folks, I do a lot of guest lecturing, and I tell college students, it is a great resume build. It's a great education, and don't wait till the end of your career like I did to do it. Do it sometime earlier, because you're going to be more valuable to the private sector from a business standpoint. Just understanding how budgets work, how the grant process works, how regulations done, how laws are made. All that was just tremendous educational to me. So what are you doing now, and how did this help you in your current ventures?
No, it's a great question, and so. The federal government is the largest customer of space services, right? And so there's tremendous opportunity out there to help commercial companies that want to learn how to do business with the federal government, want to grow their businesses within the federal government. So Jim Bridenstine, former NASA administrator, myself, our former press secretary at NASA, Matt Ryden, and one of our legislative specialists, Emily Helms. We have our own firm called the Artemis Group, of all things. We figured we started the program. We might as well name our consultancy that as well, right? So we, day in and day out, we're helping companies grow. We're helping them make new relationships and connections inside of the federal government. We're also trying to help them meet new investors that can bring private capital to the table for their organizations, for their vision. And we're also helping try and grow the space industry inside of the state of Oklahoma. One of the things that stood out to me is my girls, I tell the story a lot. We go to these launches and they'd ask me, well, why don't we do anything like this in Oklahoma? Why don't we have any space stuff in Oklahoma? And so Jim's in Oklahoma and I'm in Oklahoma, and so is Matt and Emily. We wanted to come back and get Oklahoma in the space game. And so every day, those are the things that we get to focus on with our business, and we have a great time with it. And I would echo that counsel that you're giving to younger folks as they build their careers. This level of experience, it is special. It is going to open doors for them that otherwise would not be opened. And the story that you get to develop throughout your career around these particular experiences is a powerful one, and one that you can share with a lot of people, not only to inspire them to do bigger things or to think bigger, but also to maybe shift some of their thoughts about what their career looks like. Maybe it's not 25 years at the same company. Maybe it's a few years here, a few years in government, then a few years in something new. And you can really leverage and build off of that experience that you have in the executive branch. And so I just love the counsel that you're giving to them. And I think that it is a worthy effort of service that will benefit the career long term.
Gabe, we're running out of time here, but I want to thank you so much, and I also want to invite you back. I mean, this conversation sparked about 100 other questions I'd love to talk about. So, if we can indulge your time a little bit more down the road, I'd love to have you back and take a deeper dive in some of these topics. So.
Happy to do it, Irv.